Continuing with rule number 12 and the section for rule number 12, suffering and the limitations of being, I'd realized something relevant to this. Years before, about 3-year-old Julian. Remember him? I thought, I love my son. He's 3 and cute and little and comical, but I am also afraid for him because he could be hurt. If I had the power to change that, what might I do? I thought. He could be 20 feet tall instead of 40 inches. Nobody could push him over then. He could be made of titanium instead of flesh and bone. Then, if some brat bounced a toy drunk off his noggin, he wouldn't care. He could have a computer-enhanced brain, and even if he was damaged somehow, his parts could be immediately replaced. Problem solved. But no, not problem solved, and not just because such things are currently impossible. Artificially fortifying Julian would have been the same as destroying him. Instead of his little 3-year-old self, he would be a cold, steel-hard robot. That wouldn't be Julian, it would be a monster. I came to realize through such thoughts that what can be truly loved about a person is inseparable from their limitations. Julian wouldn't have been little and cute and lovable if he wasn't also prone to illness, loss, pain, and anxiety. Since I loved him a lot, I decided that he was alright the way he was, despite his fragility. It's been harder with my daughter. As her disease progressed, I began to piggyback her around, not on my shoulders. When we went for walks, she started taking oral nasoproxen and methotrexate, the latter a powerful chemotherapy agent. She had a number of cortisol injections, wrists, shoulders, ankles, elbows, knees, hips, fingers, toes, and tendons, all under general anesthesia. This helped temporarily, but her decline continued. One day, Tammy took Michaela to the zoo. She pushed her around in a wheelchair. That was not a good day. Her rheumatologist suggested prednisolone, a corticosteroid long used to fight inflammation. But prednisolone has many side effects, not the least of which is severe facial swelling. It wasn't clear that this was better than the arthritis, not for a little girl. Fortunately, if that is the right word, the rheumatologist told us of a new drug. It had been used previously, but only on adults, so Michaela became the first Canadian child to receive Entrapacept, a biological specifically designed for the autoimmune diseases. Tammy accidentally administered 10 times the recommended dose the first few injections. Poof, Michaela was fixed. After a few weeks after the trip to the zoo, she was zipping around, playing Little League soccer. Tammy spent all her summer just watching her run. We wanted Michaela to control as much of her life as she could. She had always been strongly motivated by money. One day we found her outside, surrounded by the books of her early childhood, selling them to passerbys. I sat her down one evening and told her that I would give her $50 if she could do the injections herself. She was 8. She struggled for 35 minutes, holding the needle close to her thigh. Then she did it. Next time I paid her $20, but only gave her 10 minutes. Then it was $10 in 5 minutes. We stayed at 10 for quite a while. It was a bargain. After a few years, Michaela became completely symptom-free. The rheumatologist suggested that we start weaning her off her medications. Some children grow out of JIA when they hit puberty. No one knows why. She began to take methotrexate in pill form instead of injecting it. Things were good for 4 years. Then one day, her elbow started to ache. We took her back to the hospital. You only have one actively arthritic joint, said the rheumatologist assistant. It wasn't only. 2 isn't much more than 1, but 1 is a lot more than 0. 1 meant that she hadn't outgrown her arthritis despite the hiatus. The news demolished her for a month, but she was still in dance class and playing ball games with her friends on the street in front of our house. The rheumatologist had some more unpleasant things to say the next September when Michaela started grade 11. An MRI revealed joint deterioration at the hip. She told Michaela, your hip will have to be replaced before you turn 30. Perhaps the damage has been done before the Entracept worked its miracle. We didn't know. It was ominous news. One day, a few weeks later, Michaela was playing ball hockey in our high school gym. Her hip locked up. She had to hobble off the court. It started to hurt more and more. The rheumatologist said, some of your femur appears to be dead. You don't need a hip replacement when you're 30. You need one now. As I sat with my client as she discussed her husband's advancing illness, we discussed the fragility of life, the catastrophe of existence, and the sense of nihilism evoked by the specter of death. I started with my thoughts about my son. She had asked, like everyone in her situation, why my husband? Why me? Why this? My realization of the tight interlinking between vulnerability and being was the best answer I had for her. I told her an old Jewish story, which I believe in part is the commentary of the Torah. It begins with a question, structured like a Zen koan. Imagine a being who is omniscient, omnipresent, and omnipotent. omnipotent. What does such a being lack? The answer, limitation. If you are already everything, everywhere, always, there is nowhere to go and nothing to be. Everything that could be already is, and everything that could happen already has. And it is for this reason, so the story goes, that God created man. No limitations, no story. No story, no being. That idea had helped me to deal with the terrible fragility of being. It helped my client too. I don't want to overstate the significance of this. I don't want to claim that this somehow makes it all okay. She still faced the cancer afflicting her husband just as I still face my daughter's terrible illness. But there's something to be said for recognizing that existence and limitation are inextricably linked. Inextricably linked. Though 30 spokes may form the wheel, it is the hole within the hub which gives the wheel utility. It is not the clay the potter throws which gives the pot its usefulness, but the space within the shape from which the pot is made. Without a door, the room cannot be entered, and without its windows, it is dark. Such is the utility of non-existence. That was like a poem that he added there, I guess. Or it's a reference or something. A realization of this sort emerged recently in the pop culture world during the evolution of the DC Comics cultural icon Superman. Superman was created in 1938 by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. In the beginning, he could move cars, trains, and even ships. He could run faster than a locomotive. He could leap over tall buildings in a single bound. As he developed over the next 4 decades, however, Superman's powers began to expand. By the late 60s, he could fly faster than light. He had super hearing and X-ray vision. He could blast heat rays from his eyes. He could freeze objects and generate hurricanes with his breath. He could move entire planets. Nuclear blasts didn't faze him, and if he did get hurt somehow, he would immediately heal. Superman became invulnerable. Then a strange thing happened. He got boring. The more amazing his abilities became, the harder it was to think of interesting things for him to do. DC first overcame this problem in the 1940s. Superman became vulnerable to the radiation produced by kryptonite, a material remnant of his shattered home planet. Eventually, more than 24 variants emerged. Green kryptonite weakened Superman. In the sufficient dosage, it could even kill him. Red caused him to behave strangely. Red-green caused him to mutate. He once grew a third eye in the back of his head. That's a Superman movie they should make, the one with the third eye in the back of his head. Other techniques were necessary to keep Superman's story compelling. In 1976, he was scheduled to battle Spider-Man. It was the first superhero crossover between Stan Lee's upstart Marvel Comics with its less idealized characters and DC, the owner of Superman and Batman. But Marvel had to augment Spider-Man's powers for the battle to remain plausible. That broke the rules of the game. Spider-Man is Spider-Man because he has the powers of a spider. If he is suddenly granted any old power, he's not Spider-Man. The plot falls apart. By the 1980s, Superman was suffering from terminal Deus ex machina, a Latin term meaning God from a machine. The term described the rescue of the imperiled hero in ancient Greek and Roman plays by the sudden and miraculous appearance of an all-powerful God. In badly written stories to this very day, a character in trouble can be saved or a falling plot redeemed by a bit of implausible magic or other chicanery not in keeping with the reader's reasonable expectations. Sometimes Marvel Comics, for example, saves a failing story in exactly this manner. Lifeguard, for example, is an X-Men character who can develop whatever power is necessary to save a life. He's very handy to have around. Other examples abound in popular culture. At the end of Stephen King's The Stand, for example, spoiler alert, God himself destroys the novel's evil characters. The entire ninth season, 1985 to 1986, of the primetime soap Dallas was later revealed as a dream. Fans object to such things, and rightly so. They've been ripped off. People following a story are willing to suspend disbelief as long as the limitations making the story possible are coherent and consistent. Writers, for their part, agree to abide by the initial decisions. When writers cheat, fans get annoyed. They want to toss the book into the fireplace and throw a big brick into the TV. And that became Superman's problem. He developed powers so extreme that he could deuce himself out of anything at any time, and in consequence, in the 1980s, the franchise nearly died. Artist-writer John Byrne successfully rebooted it, rewriting Superman, retaining his biography but depriving him of many of his new powers. He could no longer lift planets or shrug off an H-bomb. He also became dependent on the sun for his power, like a reverse vampire. He gained some reasonable limitations. A superhero who can do anything turned out to be no hero at all. He's nothing specific, so he's nothing. He has nothing to strive against, so he can't be admirable. Being of any reasonable sort appears to require limitation. Perhaps this is because being requires becoming as well as mere static existence, and to become is to become something more, or at least something different. This is only possible for something limited. Fair enough. But what about the suffering caused by such limits? Perhaps the limits required by being are so extreme that the whole project should just be scraped. Dostoevsky expressed the idea very clearly in the voice of the protagonist of Notes from Underground. So you can see anything about world history, anything and everything that the most morbid imagination can think of, except for one thing. That is, that was that is, it cannot be said that world history is reasonable. The world sticks to one's throat. Goethe's Metamorphosis, the adversary of being, announces his opposition explicitly to God's creation in Faust, as we have seen. Years later, Goethe wrote Faust Part 2. He has the devil repeat his credo in a slightly different form, just to hammer home the point. Gone to sheer nothing, past with null made one. What matters our creative endless toil, when, at a snatch, oblivion ends the coil. It is bygone. How shall this riddle run? As good as if things never had begun. Yet circle back, existence to possess. I'd rather have eternal emptiness. Anyone can understand such words when a dream collapses, a marriage ends, or a family member is struck down by a devastating disease. How can reality be structured so unbearably? How can this be? Perhaps, as the Columbine boys suggested, see Rule 6, it would be better not to be at all. Perhaps it would be even better if there was no being at all. But people who came to the former conclusion are flirting with suicide, and those who come to the latter with something worse, something truly monstrous. They're consorting with the idea of the destruction of everything. They are toying with genocide and worse. Even the darkest regions have still darker corners, and what is truly horrifying is that such conclusions are understandable, maybe even inevitable, although not inevitably acted upon. What is a reasonable person to think when faced, for example, with a suffering child? It is not precisely the reasonable person, the compassionate person, who would find such thoughts occupying his mind. How could good God allow such a world as this to exist? Logical they might be, understandable they might be, but there is a terrible catch to such conclusions. Acts undertaken in keeping with them, if not the thoughts themselves, inevitably serve to make a bad situation even worse. Hating life, despising life, even for the genuine pain that life inflicts, merely serves to make life itself worse, unbearably worse. There is no genuine protest in that. There is no goodness in that, only the desire to produce suffering for the sake of suffering. That is the very essence of evil. People who come to that kind of thinking are one step from total mayhem. Sometimes they merely lack the tools. Sometimes, like Stalin, they have the finger on the nuclear bomb. But is there any coherent alternative, given these self-evident horrors of existence? Can being itself, with its malaria mosquitoes, child soldiers, and degenerative neurological diseases, truly be justified? I'm not sure I could have formulated a proper answer to such a question in the 19th century, before the totalitarian horrors of the 20th were monstrously perpetuated on millions of people. Like the 20th century was like a lot worse than this current 21st century. I don't know that it's possible to understand why such doubts are morally impermissible without the fact of the Holocaust and the Stalinist purges and Mao's catastrophic Great Leap Forward. And I also don't think it is possible to answer the question by thinking. Thinking leads inexplorably to the abyss. It does not work for Tolstoy. It might not even have worked for Nietzsche, who arguably thought more clearly about such things than anyone in history. But if it is not thinking that can be relied upon in the direst situation, what is left? Thought, after all, is the highest of human achievements, is it not? Perhaps not. Sometimes something supersedes thinking, despite its truly awesome power. When existence reveals itself as existential, intolerable, thinking collapses on itself. In such situations, in the depths, it's noticing, not thinking, that does the trick. Perhaps you might start by noticing this. When you love someone, it's not despite their limitations, it's because of their limitations. Of course, it's complicated. You don't have to be in love with every shortcoming in merely every aspect. You shouldn't stop trying to make life better or let suffering just be, but there appear to be limits on the path to improvement beyond what we might not want to go, lest we sacrifice our humanity itself. Of course, it's one thing to say being requires limitation. and then to go about happily when the sun is shining and your father is free of Alzheimer's disease and your kids are healthy and your marriage happy. But what when things go wrong? That was from Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules from Life. That was from rule number 12. When you see a cat on the street, stop to pet it. My name is Gregory Brand. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button and check out some of my other videos. I'm a writer. I wrote a book called Gonzo Education. There's a playlist of my book, my memoir, Gonzo Education. I welcome you to check that out. Thanks again for watching. Have a nice day.